So what are shared preferences? Well, basically, shared preferences is a mechanism that we have in Android that makes it really easy to store information about our application in between the invocations. So we can persist. It's a very easy mechanism to persist data in Android. It's a lot easier than some of the other mechanisms that we could use, and it's kind of built in. We have a framework there that allows us to be able to do that. We can also store different sets of preferences. What I mean by this is that we can store preferences for different types of things in our application. So we have some higher level way of managing our preferences. Instead of just having one set of shared preferences, we can have multiple sets, and we can specify a key to say, I want to pull up the preferences about the user's calendar settings, or I want to pull up the preferences about the user's contact settings. We can specify in our application what the key is and then store preferences that are specific to that key. There's also multiple levels that we can store preferences at, in addition to different keys for the different types of preferences. And the two levels are the activity level and the application level. If we store shared preferences at the activity level, it is shared by that activity. So for example, when a user re-enters that activity and we re-enter that code for that activity and we ask for the preferences, we're only going to get that data for that activity. The other level is the application level. And as you might guess, if we store preferences at the application level, any code inside of our application can get those preferences and use them. So that can be useful for sharing data between activities or across our entire application. Share preferences are different than just saving state. In one of the previous modules, we had talked about using a mechanism to save state, basically to save maybe what the user had typed on the screen, what the exact state of the application was at that time. And that's more of a mechanism for saving data in case the application gets terminated in memory. Shared preferences are really not for that purpose. They're more for saving more permanent types of data that we would want to recall for different invocations of the application or different invocations of an activity. So why would we use shared preferences? Well, we have a couple other options available to us for saving data, but shared preferences are something that we're going to use in some specific cases that make sense for that particular purpose. One of those particular cases is when we have a small amount of data and we need to save that data, and we need that data to be available between invocations of an application or an activity. Really, shared preferences lend themselves best to small amounts of data. Shared preferences are essentially a dictionary. What I mean by that is that we store the data in a key and pull back a value. So if you've used maps or dictionaries in C# or Java, you'd be very familiar with the type of data storage that we're talking about here, which is what shared preferences are. So they're really going to lend themselves best to small amounts of data that we're going to save. One of the examples of small amounts of data is things like user settings, and that's commonly what they're used for in Android. An example that I could give you is that in my application, Pacemaker, I track the user's pace over time, and I let them set alerts when they are running too fast or too slow. Well, with that application, I need to save certain data, certain settings data for them, like do they want to use kilometers or miles, and what is the pace that they want to achieve, and when do they want to be alerted. And these are really small pieces of data that are going to need to be persisted for the application. So they really work well for shared preferences. Also, we like using shared preferences in those cases because it's a lot easier than writing to a file or to a database. Doing the file or database writing can be a lot more work, and it can be a lot more, we have a lot more things to worry about and to deal with. And we'll briefly mention those at the end of this module, but shared preferences are definitely a lot easier than either of those methods. So what can we actually do with the shared preferences? Well, that's a good question. We need to figure out, why is this a benefit to us? Well, the first thing I think we had mentioned already is that you can persist the data between invocations of the application. And that doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but when you realize how easy it is to store your data with shared preferences and how valuable it is to be able to grab that data between invocations of an application or an activity, then you can see why shared preferences are so useful. The other thing that we can do is persist the data across activities in an application. And this may seem obvious, but in Android, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to pass data between activities. There's some mechanisms that we can use to directly do that, but often if we have some shared data, like truly user settings, and we want to be able to access that data from one activity to another activity, shared preferences really provide us an easy mechanism for doing that. The other thing that we might want to use, or that we can do with shared preferences, is we can respond to a preference change using basically an event handler that will allow us to execute some code in response to preference changing. And this can be very useful on our application because a lot of times we don't want to just have the user update some settings, but we want to respond when they update that setting. A good example is in my pacemaker application, when the user changes from tracking pace to speed, I have a different set of data that I show the user because they can set different settings on pace or speed. So being able to respond to preferences changing is a nice feature that shared preferences gives us.